It's a magical place, we're on our way there, with toys in the millions all under one roof. It's called Toys R Us. Soon after bedtime, when dark nighttime falls, Jeffrey and helpers stock up all the shelves. From ceiling to floor, books, board games and bikes, teddies, puppets and dolls, beds, spaceships and trikes. There's millions, says Jeffrey, all under one roof. It's called Toys R Us, Toys R Us, Toys R Us.
New information this morning about the future of Toys R Us.
The company is reportedly planning to liquidate all of its U.S. stores.
Filing for liquidation and planning to close its doors after nearly 70 years.
It is official. Everything must go, and when it does, Toys R Us will cease to exist.
The shutters are down. A retail era has ended.
Bye, Toys R Us. They got a million toys at Toys R Us that I can play.
Ah, Toys R Us. If you grew up not knowing what Toys R Us is, you've either just been born or had very, very stingy parents. Toys R Us was a childhood staple for many generations. One of my earliest childhood memories was of my parents giving my brother and I £50 each to spend for our birthdays in a trolley dash style day out at our local store. And I have to admit that I can barely remember what I actually bought, but I do know that I got one of those red Viewmaster toys that you put the discs in and it shows you several pictures from movies, TV programs and stuff like that. Actually, to be honest, that's probably where most of the money went. Those things were really expensive. But my point is that for many of us, Toys R Us has been a huge part of all our lives. After all, the company has been in business since 1948. This year would have actually been its 70th anniversary. So, when at the beginning of this year the company went into full administration in the UK, I have to admit a part of me was saddened by the news, even though, admittedly, it had been on the cards for many, many years. With the company struggling to compete with newer, more up-to-date online retailers such as Amazon and newer, more up-to-date high street retailers too. But before we get into what went wrong, let's start right back at the beginning. As I said, Toys R Us opened its doors way back in 1948, but it wasn't until 1957 that the business took its iconic name. In fact, it originally started as a baby furniture store called Children's Supermarket, which operated out of Washington, D.C. Soon after opening the store, its founder Charles P. Lazarus, an army vet from World War II, started getting requests from customers to make babies' toys. And once he started selling those in the store, he also got many requests for older children's toys as well. So soon after, in 1957, the focus of the store changed completely and it became the brand we all know today as Toys R Us, and dedicated itself more towards the sale of toys rather than furniture. And it's also at this point that the original Toys R Us logo that we all know was created by Charles Lazarus himself. Interesting fact, the reason the R is actually the wrong way around is because Charles Lazarus wanted it to look like a child had actually drawn it. And the fact that it's been a massively long-standing logo, it hasn't changed very much at all, shows that I think he achieved that. But after changing the company completely to a toy store, it wasn't long after that the toy store actually took another drastic change, when in 1966 it was sold by the founder Charles Lazarus. Thinking that he had run his course with the company and that he would sell while he was ahead, he sold to Interstate Department Stores Incorporated for the sum of $7.5 million, which back then was a lot. However, he didn't just up and leave the company, he just handed over the reins. He did stay with the company as the head of the toy division, and was left overseeing all of the Toys R Us stores, of which at the time there were around 50. However, this arrangement was also short-lived, as in less than 10 years' time in 1974, Interstate, who were also the owners of Tops, Whitefront and Children's Bargain Town USA, filed for bankruptcy. And in a surprise twist, the court charged with dealing with the bankruptcy put Lazarus in charge of the company's restructuring. He goes on to sell off all the unprofitable divisions of the company and rebrands the whole of Interstate and their remaining assets as Toys R Us, and successfully digs the company out of a very nasty hole. It's also around this time that the now well-known company mascot Geoffrey Giraffe is also created, as up until this moment all the appearances in ads had been that of the more professional and probably too serious for kids, Dr. G. Raff. Along with the new mascot, Toys R Us also implemented new digital inventory systems that really helped to streamline the service in their stores, and also in 1978 became a publicly trading company in a bid to boost cash. And it worked. In 1983, the company made another new bold move and opened up their Kids R Us division of stores that was solely focused on children's clothing. And although the Kids R Us line wasn't a huge success, the company kept on expanding, and only a year later in 1984, they left the US for the first time and opened up stores in Singapore and Canada. And more locally to me, Toys R Us first reached Britain in 1985, opening 5 stores in Cardiff, Bristol, London, Woking and Basildon. One visitor of the Basildon store said, "Toys R Us was a big thing for the town when it was opened. I remember taking my children there just after it opened and being amazed. They had every toy you could possibly think of." It's really from this point on until the mid-90s that the store really saw its golden years. With business booming, this is the Toys R Us that we all remember from our childhoods. Toys stacked to the ceiling, busy stores and all the Toys R Us adverts. many adverts.
Keith, if there's something you want, better start running. Get on a train, hop on a bus. It's holiday jubilation at Toys R Us.
Moms and dads, are you looking for a bicycle, tricycle, football?
Looking for a model kit, chess set, doll? Honey, for game time, playtime, fun time.
Well, stop your looking and start to shopping at the store that has them all.
Welcome to Toys R Us. Can I help you?
Probably not. I've been all over and nobody... Is that Hokey Pokey Elmo?
Oh, well, yes it is, sir.
It's the last one. I got the last Hokey Pokey Elmo!
For me, I always remember Toys R Us at Christmas. For some reason, we only seemed to, at least in my family, visit the store around that time of year. I think probably the previously mentioned ads had something to do with that, as they would always have a new one around Christmas that would make you want to rush out and get the latest new toy, or at the very least make you bug your parents enough until they took you. Between 1992 and 1997, Toys R Us really began to expand across the globe, with new stores opening up in the likes of Hong Kong, Sweden, Portugal and many more. And business was really good. In 1994, Charles Lazarus, being nearly 71 at the time, finally stepped aside as chief executive of the company, and was preceded by Michael Goldstein. He remained on at the company as a chairman, but no longer had the executive power he once had. 1996 saw the opening of the very first Babies R Us store, which had a much closer focus on that of the original store way back in 1948 when they just made baby furniture. Although along with cots, high chairs and other furniture based items, they also did almost everything any parent could ever need for their infant. Nappies, wipes, toys, clothes and much more. And on the whole, this branch of the company was pretty successful. My local store still had a Babies R Us in it that took up almost half the store when it closed earlier this year. But at the same time over in the States, new fresh competition had been starting to emerge and make its mark. Walmart. Walmart had been on the scene for years, but had recently started providing toys in their stores at heavily discounted prices. And in 1998, Walmart managed to beat Toys R Us for the title of top US toy seller for the first time ever. At the same time, the rest of the world is seeing the growing popularity of the internet, seeing more and more companies test the waters online, including a brand new company called Amazon. In 2001, undeterred by all these new changes, Toys R Us opened a brand new flagship store in Times Square, Designed to impress and touted as the largest toy store in the world, the store boasted a huge 3-story Ferris wheel and a 20-foot animatronic T-Rex inside the store. Undeniably, it was an impressive store, but maybe it would have been wiser in hindsight if the company had focused more on emerging competition and less on grand gestures. However, let's not forget hindsight is a wonderful thing, and at the time, despite the competition, Toys R Us was still a massively successful company. At the end of 2001, the company reported a 4% rise in net sales, from $10.7 billion to $11 billion. But right now in the early 2000s was the start of the company's downfall. Little things started happening, things that weren't all that noticeable until it was too late, that eventually led to the company's downward spiral. Toys R Us had grown massive and had a whopping 1,500 stores across the globe, and was still seeing huge profits. It had also struck an amazing deal with Amazon that saw the online retailer exclusively selling Toys R Us toys. But in 2005, things started to look a little more bleak. Competition was fierce and Toys R Us were losing. In the last few years, Walmart had secured the top spot, and several other similar companies had been beating the company's prices and pulled away a considerable amount of the customer base. Don't get me wrong though, they were still successful. They were still making a considerable amount of profit and sales had only dropped a little. But in July 2005, that all changed. Toys R Us was sold in a leveraged buyout to 3 individual investment companies, who took control of the majority of the company's shares and pretty much outright purchased the company for $6.6 billion. However, this is where the real issues came, as the companies didn't have the cash. Not spare anyway. So the money used, a good chunk of it was actually borrowed money. This meant that Toys R Us was now taking on nearly $5.5 billion worth of debt that they didn't have before. The company was also taken off the stock markets and made once again, for the first time since 1978, a privately owned company. And with sales on the slow decline already, this was a recipe for disaster. In fact, it got so bad that they eventually had to kill off the Kids R Us branch of the business that just wasn't making any money. And with online retail becoming a huge part of the business, many other online retailers started becoming big competition, the largest of which, at least in the US, was Target. Alongside a changing market and newer competition, the company's deal with Amazon also turned sour and ended in a costly lawsuit that saw Toys R Us suing Amazon for them breaking the deal they had made to only sell Toys R Us toys through their site. Incidentally, Toys R Us did end up winning the lawsuit and was able to terminate their 10-year contract with Amazon, and Amazon also had to pay $51 million to Toys R Us to settle the dispute. But with the debts that Toys R Us now had, this was like a drop in the ocean. And in hindsight, us all knowing how successful Amazon is now, they probably would have done better to stay with Amazon even if they weren't getting exclusive sales. Toys R Us also went on to try and start buying up all the online toy site competitors in an attempt to get a foothold on the online market, but also at the same time to eliminate some of the competition. And although in some ways it did work, it also added even more to the debts they already had, making the sum they had to pay back even larger. And even though the company on face value was still doing very well, with net sales of around $13 billion, the debt they had was eventually going to become a huge problem. In 2010, the company opened up some stock to the public in an attempt to raise some money to pay off some of the debts. But now the competition was just too fierce. Target, Walmart and Amazon were pretty much dominating the toy market, and customers were beginning to lose brand loyalty with Toys R Us. With the growth of the internet and online retailers, it was now much easier to find products quickly and more often than not at lower prices. And over the next few years, the company's decline became more and more prominent, and annual profits started turning into annual losses. And eventually in 2015, the flagship store in Times Square was closed for good. And unfortunately, this seems to mark a new trend for the company, with them closing stores all over in an attempt to save money where it could. But with less stores comes less opportunities to sell, and losses increased with declining sales. In 2017, the inevitable finally happened. The struggling company hired a law firm that specialises in corporate restructuring in a last-ditch attempt to salvage the sinking company. But it was too little, too late. And in February 2018, Toys R Us British operations entered administration. And a month later, the company announced that it would close all US and British stores by June of that year. Unfortunately, March 2018 also saw the passing of Charles Lazarus, the company's original founder. Something I wanted to mention this because it's something I feel has been overlooked in a lot of other media and other people covering the history of Toys R Us. And it's kind of sad to think that the founder died almost exactly the same time as the company. As I said at the beginning, Toys R Us for me is one of those stores I will never forget. Not just for how long the company went on for, or for how widespread its reach across the globe was, but because when I was a 10-year-old kid tugging my parents' sleeve, begging for the latest Mighty Max set, Turtles toy or Star Wars lightsaber, this place was the most magical place on Earth.
There's a magical place, we're on our way there, with toys in the millions millions all under one roof. It's called Toys R Us.
So that's it. That is all she wrote. Or is it?